Hi everybody! This video goes over your second response paper, which is on Kindred. So as with your first response paper, this response paper has two components. The first part is a 200 to 300 word passage from Kindred that's typed out in a separate document. And then the second part is a 2 to 3 page paper that analyzes the passage you've chosen. And as with the first response paper, you're welcome to write on the same passage that you discussed in a journal or a discussion post, or you can write on something new. And you're also welcome to expand on points that you made in a journal or in a discussion post. So for this response paper, I'm asking you to explain how the passage you've selected either develops a character or develops a theme in the novel. So this means that you should pick a passage that focuses on a character or a theme. After you've chosen the passage, you should type it out in a separate document, and then you'll be submitting that document along with your paper. If you have like an electronic version of the book, you can also copy and paste it, but you will probably find this activity more useful if you type it out. And then I also encourage you to print it out and take time to read over it and mark it up. You may even find it helpful to underline passages or words, or circle things or write in the margins. This is what a lot of scholars do when they're preparing to write. So this process of going through and annotating a passage can be really helpful and useful as you begin to figure out what it is that you want to say about the passage. I've provided you some questions that you might find useful as you analyze the passage that you've chosen. I will be going over all of these questions, and you can also find them in the prompt that is on Blackboard. So the first prompt is useful if you're choosing a passage that focuses on a character. So if you are focusing on a passage that focuses on a character, you might consider how the narrator, who's Dana, describes the character. So what does her description reveal about the character's history and or personality? What does her description reveal about the character's relationship with other people? If the passage focuses on a character, you can also think about what the character is actually doing and saying in the passage. So thinking about how the character is indirectly characterized. So what do these details, what the character says and does, reveal about the character's personality and or history? And then what do these details reveal about the character's relationship with other people? Also, if the character that you're focusing on is a slave, you might find it really useful to pay attention to any references to the character's history or experiences with slavery. As we've talked about in discussions, one of the ideas that the novel Kindred explores is slavery. So this could be a useful sort of entry point into thinking about how this passage represents the experience of slavery. So you might think about what choices the character is making in order to survive as a slave in antebellum America, and what kind of choices the character is making in order to protect people he or she cares about. So that might be useful questions to think about how this passage is illustrating the experience of slavery. If you're choosing a passage that discusses a sort of violent event, you can also sort of pay attention to how that violence is depicted. So specifically thinking about the imagery and the details that are used in the passage. And you might think about how the imagery and details highlight the violence that slaves and free blacks were subject to in antebellum Maryland, and perhaps how this imagery and these details highlight the difference between sort of just reading about an historical event, the way that we might sort of read in a history textbook, and the difference between that and actually sort of experiencing an event. And then finally, another question that you might find useful is if the passage is set in 1979, so set in the 20th century, not in the 1800s, you might look for connections between the present and the past, especially any instances of racism that are happening in the 20th century. And you can think about how the legacy of slavery and institutional racism continue to impact people in the late 20th century within this passage. Those are just some ideas. You are welcome to consider other parts of the passage and other themes that the passage that you've chosen deals with. And if you have questions about that, or you want to run some ideas by me, you are welcome to send me an email or set up a time to talk about it with me. Okay, so once you've chosen your passage and spent some time thinking about your passage, you need to write your paper. So as with the last response paper, this paper doesn't necessarily need to have a fully developed introduction or conclusion, but it should have a thesis. So it should have a statement, one or two sentences that explain your argument, and it should present textual evidence that support that thesis. So I'll talk a little bit about the theses first. So your thesis should make a specific interpretive claim about how Butler uses word choice imagery or other details to develop a character or a theme. So in other words, it should explain how sort of the details of that passage, whether that's word choice imagery, other formal elements, or even just the details of the sort of specific things that are being described in the passage, how those sort of reveal an aspect of a character or develop one of the sort of themes that we've been talking about in our discussions. And I give you an example of a weak thesis and a stronger thesis. So the weak thesis is, in this passage from Kindred, Dana describes watching Alice's mother and father be attacked by patrollers. So this thesis just basically tells me what is happening in the passage. It tells me that the passage is about Dana watching Alice's mother and father be attacked by patrollers. But it doesn't tell me why that passage is important. It doesn't tell me what that passage reveals about a character or what that passage reveals about any themes. So a stronger thesis would be one that basically adds a second sentence that goes into detail and explains how that passage is developing important themes that are in the novel. So the thesis that I've given is, in this passage from Kindred, Dana describes watching Alice's mother and father be attacked by patrollers. The vivid imagery highlights the violence inflicted on people of color in the antebellum period and calls attention to the difference between reading about history and experiencing history. So this thesis basically argues that the passage reveals two important themes. So one theme that the passage reveals is the violence that was inflicted on people of color, both slaves and free blacks. And then the other theme that the passage reveals is the difference between sort of simply reading about history and experiencing history, which if you go back and look at Dana's description of, watching the patrollers, beat Alice's mother and father, she's sort of really surprised by sort of the visceral experience of watching this and how different it is from sort of seeing violence on TV or reading about violence in a book. So those are a second theme that gets developed in this passage. And the thesis that I have here calls attention to that theme. And then the rest of the paper should support and develop the thesis. So just like with your last response paper, each paragraph should have a clear claim, which is presented in a topic sentence, and then the rest of the paragraph should develop or support that claim. And a general rule is that every time you make a point or claim, you should present a quotation or example that supports that claim, and then an explanation of how the quotation or example supports the topic sentence. And as I've said before, teachers sometimes call this a sort of quotation sandwich, because you're sandwiching the quotation between the claim and the explanation of the quotation. And if you want to talk about this more, I'm happy to talk about this in a meeting or to show you some examples of that. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the general paper requirements. So as with your last paper, this should be formatted according to MLA style. So this means it should be typed and 12-point Times New Roman font. It should be double spaced. It should have 1-inch margins. It should have a heading with the page number and your last name in the top right corner of every page. And it should have a heading in the top left corner of the first page with your name, the instructor's name, the class, and the date. And quotations should be properly formatted and documented using parenthetical citations. And there's a handout on Blackboard that can show you how to do that. And then I should have an MLA style works cited page that lists the novel. And there's also a handout on Blackboard that shows you how to do that as well. And then you will submit both the passage and the paper to the Dropbox in the Week 9 folder. And both these parts are going to be due on Sunday, October 20th. So this is similar to the last response paper. And if you, again, want an example of what this looks like, you can look at the sample response paper that I posted for the last response paper. It's basically sort of the same format. So if you follow that format, you should be good. If you have any questions, however, feel free to either email me or post them to the Ask My Instructor discussion forum on Blackboard. And otherwise, I look forward to seeing your guys' papers.